opportunities arising from the multi-tier framework data. So just to introduce ourselves first, my name is Nigel Scott. I'm a director at Gamos, and I was involved in some of the early work that went on leading up to the MECS program. And now I spend a bit of time supporting different bits of the program, particularly looking at data and analysis. So I think I know most of you. Alisha.
Hi, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Alisha Pinto. I'm an energy specialist at ESMAP within the World Bank. I work on the Clean Cooking Fund and have worked in the past on the multi-tier framework surveys. So I'll be providing a bit of a background on the work we've done.
Yeah, thanks, Alisha, and thank you very much. I hadn't realised Alisha has very kindly come off her Thanksgiving break holiday to join us this morning. So we're very we're honoured to have you, Alisha. So can I just do a bit of housekeeping first? So this session is being recorded. If you've got a problem with that, I guess all you can do is mute your microphone, keep quiet, or log off, but please don't do that. And can you make sure your microphones are muted and your camera is off, unless, of course, during the Q&A sessions you'd like to speak, ask a question, in which case please do raise your hand and then we can invite you to speak, which would be great. So this, I think, Alisha, this is a good session because it gives us an opportunity for ESMAP and the sort of UK MECS team to work together and present together and share this platform. And Alisha very kindly sort of used the ESMAP contacts list to send out an invitation to join us for this event. So there may be people outside of the sort of normal MECS family joining us, in which case you're very welcome. And you may not be familiar with the MECS program, so let me just take a minute to explain. The Modern Energy Cooking Services Programme is a 5-year initiative funded by UK aid through the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and is led by Loughborough University and the World Bank's Energy Sector Management Assistance Programme, ESMAP. The programme aims to has a range of activities, the overall aim of which is to accelerate the transition from traditional biomass cooking to modern energy cooking solutions. Now, we've deliberately avoided the word clean cooking in the title because we've spent ages arguing about what clean means, but you'll notice in certainly my presentation there's a bit of a focus on electricity, and that's simply because we feel this may not have received the attention it deserves. But also because the program does also include other fuels, LPG and renewables such as bioethanol. So in this session, we wanted to talk about these rich data sets that are now being made publicly available by ESMAP and how they can be put to use in the policy and private sector fields in particular. So first of all, as Alisha said, I think she's going to give a broad view of the overview of the multi-tier framework, and then I'm going to take a few minutes to just go through a bit of initial analysis that we've done looking at energy access. So Alisha, can I hand over to you, please?
Yes, thank you. So I'll walk through the concept of the MTF, the questionnaire and the data that's been collected, and then the process that we've gone through to collect this data and what the current status is. And hopefully this will set the stage for the rest of the presentations and the discussion we have afterwards. So the first slide. So in 2015, ESMAP launched the Multi-Tier Framework Initiative, which has been developed and implemented in close coordination with several partners. The theory and the framework was initially laid out in the Beyond Connections report, with the aim to provide, to collect and provide a comprehensive data set at the country level on energy and provide analysis and insights through country diagnostic reports on a country's energy status, and then use this knowledge to inform policy making and decisions on providing energy access to the country. So next slide. So the MTF, the multi-tier framework, was developed as a tool that can track the Sustainable Development Goal 7.1. This goal is to ensure universal access to affordable, reliable, and modern energy for all. And the idea of having a definition, the multi-tier definition, is that it can go beyond the binary of whether a household has a grid connection, a connection to electricity, or whether a household has a clean stove and clean fuel. So it takes a more comprehensive look at this definition of access. It acknowledges that access lies on a spectrum. So a household can experience different levels and different services, even if they have just an electricity connection or a grid connection. So the idea of the multi-tier framework was that it lies within this target, this SDG 7.1 target. The different attributes that are used to make up the MTF definition are taken from access, where you see we talk about capacity and availability on the electricity side, and then the type of fuel and technology on the cooking side. Affordability, we're looking at if the energy solution is affordable for the household, whether it's reliable for the household, and whether it's modern. And then there are a few other attributes that make up the definition as well. And I'll walk through that with you in the next slide. So on the cooking side, we measure access to modern energy cooking services using 6 attributes. We have exposure, and efficiency, which are 2 performance-based attributes. Exposure takes into account the stove technology and the fuel that households are using. It looks at different aspects of that use. So it's a proxy for the emissions that the stoves and fuel have. Looking at the ventilation, how long households are cooking for. Efficiency is the efficiency of the technology. The convenience is whether households, how much time households spend collecting fuel, preparing their stoves, and then you have the safety of the fuel, whether there are injuries related to the fuel, whether they're burns or any kind of other injuries, health issues, health impacts that we ask the household about. And then whether the fuel is available when the household needs the fuel. So if it's available throughout the year or just partially, and then households have to stack with other fuels. And finally, affordability. So what percentage of the household income annually is being spent on fuel. And one thing I want to say for both clean cooking or modern energy cooking services, as well as electricity, is that it's set up so that it's technology neutral, and it depends on the level of performance or the household experience with using these different sources. So moving to electricity, there are 7 attributes. You have the capacity of the system. So depending on what is the main source of electricity that the household is connecting to, and what capacity that is. So whether it's the grid, whether it's a mini grid, some kind of off-grid solution, or no electricity, so whether people are using candlelight. When is the electricity service available? This is especially true for mini grid and the grid system, whether it's reliable. So what are the outages, the number of outages and the frequency, the quality, whether there are voltage fluctuations. If it's affordable, the share of the household's annual expenditure that's spent on their electricity bill. Whether the connection is formal or informal, so whether they're paying somebody to get that electricity or if they're not, and how safe it is. So the way the definition works, and I can explain that on the next slide, is that with each of these attributes, we score households on a tier starting from 0 to 5. 0 being the lowest level, and then you have incremental improvements in the household's energy services up to tier 5. So here's an example from the electricity, the MTF for electricity. You can see at tier 0, households maybe only have a candlelight. And then as they move up, they experience either a grid or some other kind of electricity system, which allows them to have 4 hours of electricity in total. And then you have more hours during the day and night. They can add in more appliances until you reach tier 5, where households have almost 24 hours of electricity supply. They can use whatever appliances they need. It's reliable, it's affordable, and it's safe to use. So that brings us to, so we've covered what the MTF theory and why it was set up. And now I want to talk about, on the next slide, how we've collected this data, what the questionnaire tells us, and what information we get from it. So the questionnaire was developed also in coordination with a lot of partners. It's a very comprehensive questionnaire. It's very detailed. It covers various aspects of the household energy experience, as well as information on the demographics within the household. So asking each of the household members about their age, education, employment, asking about the characteristics of the household, whether households have, what kind of house they live in, what kind of supplies they have, and to ascertain their socioeconomic status. And then also attitudes about energy services and electricity. Then we have a very comprehensive section on electricity and cooking, where we ask about each source of electricity and each source in detail. So whether it's a grid, mini grid, off grid, or any solar off-grid solar connection, or even fuels that are used. We ask about their consumption, their level of service, reliability, how much they pay. And then for households that don't have connection to the grid, we ask about their willingness to connect, or their willingness to get off-grid solar system. Similarly, for cooking, we ask households about all the technologies that they use, all the types of stoves that they use. So we're trying to get information about stacking on fuel consumption, their behaviors, trying to find out who is the primary cook, how much time they spend in the kitchen area, how much time they spend preparing the stove, what are the costs for the stove, but also for the fuel, because this is really important. And then we also understand that there's a very different gender experience, especially when it comes to cooking, on the health impacts, on how much time is spent, and then understanding who does what within the household. So who is spending time collecting fuel, who is spending time within the household to do different activities, and then who bears the different types of health impacts, whether there are costs, what has the household experience been. And lastly, to wrap up this slide, we also collect data on the economic aspect of the household. So we try and collect consumption data on the different, for the previous month that we do the interview, what are the food and non-food items, what are the different assets, house ownership, what kinds of shocks households have experienced. And this is to get a more detailed picture of the households, how the household fares in the larger community. So I'll talk next about the data collection process. So this questionnaire, which is the standalone questionnaire, is about an hour and a half to 2 hours long, and they've been, from the first set of surveys that we did, we've tried to improve and improve on the questionnaire as well as on the data collection process. All the surveys work in close coordination with the National Statistics Office in country. Before we implement the survey, we try and understand what the situation is in the country. So understand what sources of energy are easily available, what are commonly used, what are the range of prices for the different fuels or the different stoves that are available in the market. And these get incorporated into the questionnaire or into when we do the analysis after the data is collected. And then the questionnaire is adapted for the local context and translated. There's a standardized sampling strategy, and it is, so this would just be an overview, but it's about 3,000 to 3,500 households within a country. It's a nationally representative sample. The households we get a selection of households that represent urban areas as well as rural areas, as well as households that are representative of those who are connected to the grid and non-grid users. And the last one is specifically because we want to understand the experience of households that are connected to the grid, and that's usually under-surveyed, or in a random sample, it would be under-surveyed. And then the data collection process takes about 3 to 4 months, and then we do the data cleaning and analysis and write up the report. So what are the different tools that have come out of the MTF and that we've developed, we currently use, and that will be available for the public? So we have the long module and the short module. The long module is more of the standalone survey that I talked about, but we have a shorter module which is about 20 questions, 25 questions. We worked on this through, we had multiple workshops co-hosted with the World Health Organization and got input from various stakeholders on questions that are essential. And they cover the questions that are needed to calculate the multi-tier framework for energy access, both for clean cooking, or for cooking, as well as for electricity. The questionnaire has been programmed into CAPI. So we use, in the field, we use tablets or mobile phones to collect this data. There have been 1 or 2 exceptions, but those are more related to the security issue where we've used paper-based interview platforms and paper-based interviews. But the idea was, initially we had the survey firms collect and program the questionnaire. And now we've switched to using Survey Solutions, which is a World Bank platform. The questionnaire is coded and it's available online through Survey Solutions, the detailed questionnaire. And we hope to make this available to the public. We're also working with the World Bank LSMS team, which is the Living Standards Measurement Survey team, and the World Health Organization, to develop an energy guidebook. The guidebook is a comprehensive guidance to help policymakers understand the need, the importance of having this energy data for planning, but also take them through the whole process. So For the short module, we go through each of the questions, provide guidance on why the questions were asked, how to use the data that's collected from those questions, and translate it into indicators, into meaningful data that can help track progress towards SDG 7. And finally, to give you an idea of where we currently stand, on the next slide, the MTF team has successfully implemented this data collection work in 16 countries, and along the way we've had a lot of lessons that we've learned, and we've tried to improve the data collection process as well as the survey, the instruments, and we've moved to our second wave of data collection. So the next round will be Zimbabwe, Burundi, Sierra Leone, Malawi, Cameroon, and Burkina Faso. And these are different stages, and I think some of it would be dependent on how the pandemic and countries are, how countries are doing with the pandemic. So all this data is available online. There are some countries that we've finished the data collection, but we're still working on the analysis and writing up the country diagnostic reports. But the ESMAP policy is to make all available to the public, and we really encourage researchers, policymakers to use this information, to use this very comprehensive data set. There are more than 1,000 variables on every aspect of energy use, on the household behavior, on sources, and it's a good source for us to understand where we stand, and then as we move forward to continue collecting data, similar data, so we can track progress. So on the last slide, I have the link to where you can find the data. It's on energydata.info. And there's also the MTF energyaccess.esmap.org, which gives you information. It also is the MTF website, and it has tools where you can see the results. You can play around with the data a little bit and see the results on electricity access as well as modern energy cooking services. So I'll stop here and turn it over to Nigel to take us forward. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Alisha. No, that's great, just to give us kind of the background in what we're talking about here. I know certainly within the MECS team, a lot of people are sort of familiar with it, because you've spotted that list of countries that you mentioned has a lot of overlap with the MECS priority countries. So a number of people are really interested in the data. So just thinking about the MECS program, again, one of the themes that's been sort of going through this week is this disconnect between access to electricity and using electricity for cooking. So like on Monday in Simon's opening remarks, you know, he drew attention to the amount of comparing the amount of energy invested in electricity access and the successes that we've seen there. Compare that with the relatively low levels of investment in clean cooking. Then on Thursday in our modeling session, Irene from KPLC, she confirmed that there are very low levels of revenue from a number of the people that they've recently connected onto the national grid. So they're becoming interested in trying to explore why the opportunities for people cooking with electricity, increasing demand. And then Malcolm just yesterday was talking about the finances, and he explained some of the reasons why we've seen those disparities in levels of investment. So this is a real issue. And one of the things we've noticed from looking at the the resource that MTF provides is that in the diagnostic reports that Alisha mentioned, the energy access is sort of considered in one section of the report, and the clean cooking is considered in the second section, and then they do have another section dedicated to the gender issues. But we wonder if there's anything we can learn to try and merge these two, the access and the clean cooking, and see what we can learn from there. So we started wondering if there's anything we could learn about fuel choices, and that's the work that I'm going to talk about here. So just moving on to the next slide. This is our, by way of introduction, this is the research question we set ourselves. And I'm going to draw some data from Ethiopia. The reason we used Ethiopia was that it was the first country for which data was available, and it actually happens to make quite a good case study because there are substantial numbers of people who are actually cooking with electricity. So in our analysis, we've looked at households who use a single fuel, and we make comparisons between those choices. And then we look at a transition to cooking with electricity. So people who don't cook, people who partially cook, and people who exclusively cook with electricities. We also look at different mechanisms for paying for electricity and how that interacts with cooking. And then we did some more analysis on the gendered perspective of decision making, so with respect to cooking purchases and the time burden. So I've just got a few minutes, so we're just going to focus on the first two of these just to try and illustrate what we've managed to do. So moving to the next slide, let me just give a little bit of the context of the Ethiopian place. So this graphic here is drawn from the diagnostic, which is the ESMAP report, and that shows that at the time 33% of the sample had grid electricity, 24% had an off-grid supply, and we've just compared this in the table with the National Electrification Programme have a goal to achieve 100% electrification by 2025, 65% from the grid and 35% off-grid, so mix. So that's the context within Ethiopia, but also notice that the electricity tariffs at the time the data was collected were remarkably low at 2 cents a kilowatt hour. So, and the other thing I should point out is that the analysis we've done is we've not used the weighting. So Alisha said that the data is nationally representative, but they've used the weighting factor to make that representative. We haven't used that, which is why some of our data is slightly different to the numbers you'll find in the diagnostic report. Okay, so on the next slide, we start looking at households who cooked only with a single fuel. So we find, not surprisingly, people who collect their wood tend to be the lowest status group. We're looking at a whole series of demographics here. They tend to be rural, low income levels. Then people who use purchased wood are a mix of rural and urban dwellers. And then charcoal users tend to be better off, mostly urban dwellers at this point, a lot of self-employed workers. People who cook exclusively with electricity tend to be the higher status group. Mostly urban dwellers, including some elderly and educated elites. So you can see there's a lot of this background data that's available in the data sets. If you look at the cost on cooking fuels, this is the chart on the right hand side, you can see that people who cook exclusively with electricity have relatively low household costs, certainly compared with people who are purchasing their wood. As you'd expect, people are collecting wood and then spending much more time collecting and both preparing the fuel. That's in the chart below. And I haven't put it here, but we also looked at how long people had been living in the community. And we found that people who used electricity, these are urban dwellers, had lived in their community for an average of 25 years, which was substantially longer than the people who used charcoal. So that poses the question whether this transition from charcoal to electricity is linked to a subsequent stage of the ongoing trend in urbanization. So next slide, we asked ourselves in particular whether there was something to do with the quality of supply that would be influencing people's choice of fuels. So we took these 6 variables that you can see on the screen here, which reflect different aspects of quality of supply. And we created a composite variable which reflected an overall quality of supply, where so low score was good, high score was bad. And you can see here that, yeah, there is a link between quality of supply and the use of electricity exclusively for cooking. I'm not sure exactly I'm not attributing cause and effect at this point, but there is a link. So in the next slide, we moved on to look at the attitudes held. So Alisha mentioned that they'd collected a series of attitudes from users, and these were a series of opinions relating to the pros and cons of using different fuels, the aspirations to modernity on LPG, costs of electricity, and the questions are not quite consistent across all the fuels, so you can't do a rigorous analysis, but there is enough to get some useful findings here. And what we found is that there's universal and strong agreement that firewood is harmful to health and that it's not convenient. The other thing that's interesting I've got here, people who use electricity exclusively believe that it's not expensive, and everywhere you go, you can always get an argument about the fact that food tastes better when it's cooked on biomass and charcoal, and the smoke makes it taste better. However, the attitudes show that there's no evidence of that from this data. So from this analysis, we can kind of conclude that these are the kind of drivers that are appealing to consumers: reduced health risk, convenience, and low cost. Now, on the next slide, we look to this second set of transitions. So this is this transition to cooking with electricity. So we took all the people who have access to electricity from the national grid, divided them into 3 categories. So people who don't use their electricity to cook at all, people who do use some electricity, but they stack it with other fuels, and then the people who cook exclusively with electricity, who we've just mentioned. And the figures, the mean scores in this table, again, are that same composite quality of supply indicator. And the interesting thing is that there's no difference or marginal difference between the quality of supply reported by people who don't use electricity and people who stack with electricity. So the poor quality of supply doesn't appear to be stopping people doing some cooking with electricity. However, people who use exclusively electricity have a much better quality of supply. So it does appear that the quality of supply may well be an issue that's preventing you cooking entirely with electricity. That the people are doing that voluntarily because they actually like to use other fuels, or whether they're doing involuntarily simply because when the power goes off, they have to use another fuel. We can unpack that a little bit by going to the next slide, which presents some attitudes statements again. And here we're doing the same comparison. First of all, we're doing a comparison between people who didn't cook with electricity and people who did some cooking with electricity. And that shows these the factors that were coming up there are convenience and health. So people who used the electricity were more aware of the harmful effects of biomass, and then cost. People who used the electricity were more likely to feel that the firewood and LPG were expensive. The second comparison we've done on this slide is between people who then did some cooking with electricity and people who did all their cooking with electricity. So that's kind of the later stage of this transition. And the factors that came up in that analysis were perception of cost. So the people who cook exclusively with electricity were more likely to believe it was cheap. And then the attitudes regarding all costs of all fuels tended to be sort of stronger among the people who stacked. So that suggests that they're more price sensitive market segment. But the big difference was in quality of supply. So people who, in response to the question, are you satisfied with the service from your main source of electricity? They're much more positive amongst people who cook with electricity. So that tends to support the findings that we had earlier about the impact of the quality of supply. But interestingly, people who stack their biomass fuels with electricity was just as likely to believe that it posed a health hazard. In fact, they were more likely to believe that cooking with firewood was harmful to their health. They believed that firewood was expensive, and they were just as likely to believe that biomass was an inconvenient fuel. So all of that kind of suggests that there is a latent demand for a fuel that's not biomass. So then that kind of comes back to the question about, well, why were they stacking with biomass? And that might speak to that question about, was their stacking voluntary or involuntary? So moving to the next slide, we sort of suggest that these are the kind of things that we can learn from this kind of analysis. So particular interest, I think, is understanding these drivers, what's driving people to use electricity. And there's obviously some insights there for marketing electrical cooking appliances, and what are the barriers. And so I'm going to wrap up there. Moving to the next slide, yeah, you can find the references here. But I wanted to, I should just plug Caroline's doing some actual work. Caroline is is one of our panelists. So she's taking another look at the electric cooking across all of the current MTF data, but she can tell you more about that later. So I was going to ask if we could do a quick Q&A session now. If you've got any questions for Alisha or myself on what we've presented, could you put those in the chat? Well, what I'd really like to do now is to move on to introduce our panelists, because we've got a really distinguished group of panelists, and I'd like us to make the most of them if we can. So without ado, let me introduce our three panelists. So we're very pleased to have Mr. Paul Mbuthi, who is the Deputy Director of the renewable energy at the Ministry of Energy in Kenya. He has a background in environmental policy and has been with the ministry now for over 30 years, during which time he's handled a whole range of aspects of renewable energy policy and strategy, dealing with implementation, M&E, and various projects. He's been involved in the integration of climate change perspectives into energy policy. And probably most interest to us in this conversation is that he is a member of the Technical Advisory Group on SDG 7. So welcome, Paul. I hope you can we hear you?
Thank you very much. I hope I'm audible enough.
You are very audible. Thank you. Thank you very much for joining us, Paul. That sounds like a good line.
Thank you.
We also have Caroline Ochieng with us. Caroline was involved in the design and implementation of the MTF surveys while she was seconded to the World Bank. And as I said, she's recently been commissioned to do some further work on the data, but she's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Ryan Institute at the National University of Ireland in Galway. And finally, we're pleased that Malcolm can join us, Malcolm Bricknell. He has background in corporate finance, having worked at OPEC Fund for International Development. And he's currently he's a member of the team at Loughborough University in the UK, where he's the International Liaison Manager responsible for the financial aspects of scaling up MECS. So welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
I wondered if we could kick off. Paul, can I pick on you first and ask you for your reflections on what you've heard? And also, given that you are at the sharp edge of policy making and that you have this experience of working with SDG 7, can I ask you the value that you see, the value proposition of this multidimensional framework, or frameworks like this MTF, and how that can be of value to policymakers in the target countries?
Thank you very much for having me, and it's my pleasure also to participate in this event. One of the key things that I see in this multi-tier framework that has been developed is the fact that we are moving away from the binary definitions of access. And this has given policymakers some useful insights and targets to think about in terms of looking at what quality of access, when we talk about access to electricity. It's not simply that you have a connection. The issue is what is the quality of that connection, the service you derive, and what is its reliability, and how does it relate to health impacts. So this becomes very useful because now we are going beyond to look at attributes that are so useful. So looking at it then, the issue of what is the value that we see in this proposition. And one of the things is now that we are able to go deeper into the attributes, then we are also able to make policymakers get useful consumer feedbacks because consumers are now able to choose between solutions that are more reliable, solutions that are having positive health impacts. And in that sense, it really enhances the ability of policymakers to make choices in determining what options are available and how they need to promote those options that optimize on these different attributes. The other thing that I also see is this enables policymakers to begin looking at the issue because different solutions will have different levels of affordability, and therefore enables the policymakers to get the right focus and attention to addressing these many different facets. Now, looking at it from the SDG 7 and my involvement as a member of the PAC, of course, for us, the global to achieve objectives for the SDGs is a milestone at global level. And so we look at it in terms of tracking what progress has been made over the years, and at the same time translating these policy briefs that we prepare into national insights that can help countries develop their interventions in terms of enabling them to accelerate the transition to modern energy services. I agree with one of the presenters that really the issue is not looking at clean cooking if you are looking at cooking, because the meanings are different. And this multi-tier framework provides us a sequential sort of development aspiration where we say someone is accessing a tier 1 and they are aspiring over the years to be able to afford progressively to the top tier 5. And this is why we are saying it is a good proposition for policymakers, because we now don't just speak about electrifying and reporting that these have and these do not have. We're looking at what quality. I mean, what duration is this available? And to us, that is a very critical input. Finally, I also need to add that we have seen the value it brings in terms of now looking at how do you integrate electrification and clean cooking, because electrification programs have not been speaking about cooking. And now we are saying, like, if we do the off-grid systems, the mini grids, we can now plan productive uses of electricity and other applications which are not electrical. So in that sense, this is really giving policymakers a deeper dive into these very critical elements of the multi-tier framework. So I think initially when I look at it, then I see there is a lot of benefit in going the route of the multi-tier framework. And I think it is also helping not only the global process, but also at national level to begin to re-examine what the quality of services that we are proposing. Let me hold it there and over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. There's some encouraging and interesting views there. Caroline, I mean, I think as someone who's been closely involved with the MTF implementation, I think you'd be quite encouraged at some of those remarks from Paul. Would you like to step in and respond there?
Yes, thanks, Nigel. Yeah, I think Paul has stated it clearly that, that there's a value in addition to the tracking and reporting on SDG 7, but that with that kind of rich and comprehensive data set, then you can also draw information that can be of quite a local national policy relevance. So I think one thing to also recall, we don't have many surveys of large scale that focus on cooking and electricity, sort of standardized national or regional surveys that like the MTF ones. So where you get pilot studies or cooking and electricity questions included in other surveys like living standard surveys, but then capturing a very small set of questions. So in MTF, then you have very comprehensive data. So Alisha was saying up to 1,000 variables. And even if it's used for SDG 7 tracking, I think it helps provide a more complete picture. So, and like other surveys, the focus is usually on primary cook stoves or primary cooking fuel. And based on studies we've done, one which we've published recently and which other researchers have also done, confirm that stacking is the norm. So anytime you have a survey that collects data on primary cook stoves and even lighting, we also have people stacking, then you present half the information and the policy itself is misinformed. So by using survey like MTF, then you capture the kind of clear energy sources that people use. And when making projections and also future assessments, then one can look at how much transition, say, people are making in terms of the quality or cleanliness of devices they are stacking. Because with traditional stove as the baseline, so anything else added to it, even if it's being used once a day, it's leading to some improvement. So maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thanks. Malcolm, can I bring you in at that point and ask? I mean, Paul's sort of spoken, and I think Caroline, to a certain extent, spoken to the policy side of things. But I know you've got a particular interest and background in the finance and sort of policymakers in that sphere. I wonder if you could speak to how the MTF can play a role in that world.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel. Well, I mean, I completely endorse the comments that were already made, and I think the people involved in the MTF should be strongly congratulated. I think it's a fantastic product for really understanding in depth what is going on in the sector, and then, as you say, allowing policymakers to come up with very effective programs to address different issues and really to get the benefits of the opportunities in not just the connection side, but obviously the health side, the emission reductions, the gender impacts, and the livelihood improvements. So I think it's a great tool, and I think it's logical to think of the financing in terms of being complementary to that, because clearly if we're designing or we're supporting the design of results-based financing programs, it's very useful to know what kind of results are required, what kind of results are achievable, and exactly how those programs should be structured. So I think that's I think it's going to be hugely beneficial, and I think obviously that's thinking in terms of the public sector, but private sector players and other financial institutions do have to increasingly report on the impacts that they're. And so those are not just in terms of the energy access and usage, but obviously in terms of SDG 1, poverty and health, job creation, livelihood improvements, the whole kind of Adele's health benefits side, avoidance of accidents. Then you have the SDG 5 side, addressing gender equality, so looking at job creation for women, improvements in status, the time saved, which is very, very useful on these modern energy devices, productive time freed up, and lifestyle improvements, avoiding the arduous firewood collection and the sort of the cook stove use, which can also be quite a grimy experience, I think, sometimes. Then you've got the whole SDG 13 side on climate action, on CO2 emission avoidance and black carbon avoidance. And actually one area which I think is also very important when we talk about modern energy, which is the SDG 15, the life on land side of deforestation and land degradation. So there's a lot of data which the sector requires to report on, and I think that the multi-tier framework can be very useful on that. And even going beyond that, on actually commercial data, it's really useful to, I think, have some of the data that has been flagged up, such as the adoption rates and the actual usage rates of cook stoves. That's extremely important, I think, for commercial operators. And also the question of household ability and willingness to pay. And I was really impressed by that information being available in the reports. I think of course commercial players would always want more. They always do. So they're also very interested in the technologies. But I was impressed that for example the interest in unit economics, the cost of devices, cost of fuel related to it. That information survey, as well as fuel availability and the cost of fuel. So I think there's a lot of interesting data around, and of course, commercial users would always like more, but I think there's a great deal there for them. So perhaps I could leave it there for now.
Thanks, Malcolm. Yeah, I mean that reminds me that a couple of other bits of the MECS program have already been exploiting the data from some of these data sets. So I know the team at Newcastle University, they extracted data on household appliances to use for their household load modeling. And Nick, you've been trying to get a feel for the kind of markets, what appliances are people actually purchasing from the household asset registers there. Alisha, have you been able to keep an eye on the chat to see if there's any questions there that we can put to especially to the panel? I'm keen that we should make the most of this this panel we've got here today.
Yes, I have been looking at the chat. So far, the questions have been more specific about the surveys.
Anything that you'd like to respond to there?
So one of the questions we've got is about the whole process, and I was just writing up. It's from Callan. So thanks, Callan, for that question. And I think just in terms of the survey data collection process and what are the challenges that we faced, I think we've gone, as I mentioned before, we've gone through a pretty steep learning curve with the first few surveys that were rolled out, and learned along the process on how to fine-tune some of the questions to get better quality data, but also within the mode of collection, so the CAPI program, to have certain structures in place to see that we collect good quality data and it doesn't go off. The responses, especially the open-ended responses on affordability, on costs, are not absurd. Sometimes it could be due to human error. Sometimes it could be that people have a ballpark figure, but it might be too out of the way. So try and keep our values within that. And just to also add to some of what the panelists were saying, we've been able to use this data even within the World Bank in our operation. So it has lent itself to kind of giving a background with the energy programs that we've been implementing within the World Bank to give a status of what's happening, and then help the teams build on this information to design projects. So I'll stop here. And I think we have a few more questions.
Okay. Can I, if you could keep an eye on the chats in the questions coming in the chat, Alisha. I just wanted to pick up on what you'd made a comment about some of the data is helpful for regulators and ministries to know how to promote different options. One of the questions I was going to put to you all was how can highlighting the links between cooking and electricity access stimulate clean cooking markets? Is that something you could speak to for a little bit, Paul, before we draw to a close?
Are you okay? I think now I'm audible.
You are, yes.
Thank you very much. Yes. Am I being heard?
You are? Yes, please carry on.
All right. Thank you. So I am, with regard to the links, that would be because of highlighting these links between cooking and electricity access. Indeed, we now see opportunities to put cooking alongside electrification programs, where we are speaking about mini grids. And mini grids are targeting to address electrifying community facilities, community productive uses like irrigation. We can also ensure the same can provide the benefits of cooking. And we are speaking now very loudly about electric cooking, because for many years we've not been thinking that electric cooking was an option. But it has been demonstrated by the research that MECS have done with some institutions here in Kenya that indeed it is a cheaper and a useful option, because the myth that has been there is cooking with electricity is too expensive. But I think that has been demystified, but we are in the process of now trying to scale up and providing information that would help more adoption. The other thing that I think would be of value and it can stimulate markets. If, for example, we're talking about and I give example of our COSA project, which is providing results-based financing and some debt facility for businesses that want to establish in the target project areas. That really stimulates a lot of other economic activities. This is where we're talking about productive uses. People are now able to establish small businesses that would be able to make use of the available energy resource, whether it is for electrical application or it is for other captive uses. Then this really stimulates other businesses to sprout. And so I think, yes, there is a big potential for stimulating markets. And that also brings in the issue of services and support materials that will be needed. We're talking about other businesses being triggered, insurance services, transport businesses being stimulated through this electrification which is integrating the multiple uses. So I think for me, yes, the potential to stimulate the market really exists, and from what we have seen and from the assessments that have been highlighted and from the trying to understand what these mean, we think yes, there is a good business case for markets to spur, and that is what our COSAP project intends to do. And we are thinking its implementation will provide us insights into how can we replicate this to other areas. Let me pause it there for now. Thanks.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you. And I know that you've been talking about some of the off-grid work, and Strathclyde, one of the MECS partners, did some work demonstrating how when you add cooking loads, electric cooking to a mini grid context, it brings the tariffs right down. And that then opens yet more opportunities for the productive use that you're talking about. So it seems to be a kind of virtuous spiral. I noticed we're just over time, so I wondered if, Caroline, can I just ask you to respond and maybe tell us a little bit more about what you're doing, some more work poking into more detail in this data sets, and then we just might take a couple of comments before we close. So, Caroline.
Okay. Yes, so but also to respond quickly to one of the questions I've seen on the chat. So I would say no, stacking is not something short term. So it's the norm. So the approach then would be, how do you get people to stack less with the maybe dirty stoves and stack more with the clean ones? Otherwise, it's not, I don't see it as going away any soon. But then on the question, yes, so we've been also doing analysis similar to what Nigel and the others had been doing, looking at trying to bring together the data on cooking and electricity access. And yes, there are some insights we gain from it, but I think it's one of the we are also experiencing the challenge that comes when you try to use data that was not with a certain, to then extend its use into other areas. So yes, there's definitely value, but there's also some challenges and uncertainties. So like there are some variables we don't find. So like we want to look at which type of appliances are used for cooking in a different settings. Sometimes that kind of information is incomplete. So I therefore foresee, as more people, if the MTF can be popularized and as more people use it and then can give feedback to the World Bank on other ways of improving the service so that all the core variables are captured. So because I suppose if it was being designed to help with SDG 7 tracking, but then users are using it for all different kind of purposes. If there's no feedback, then they would not likely know what areas for improvement are needed. I don't know if that answers the question.
So no, that also speaks to Simon's made a comment here about how you define people who cook with electricity or exclusively with electricity or stacking with electricity, and he raised the point that we've come across that about how you define or how you conceptualize in the survey cooking with electricity. So kettles, microwaves, rice cookers, sometimes they're regarded as cooking stoves, sometimes they're regarded as household appliances, and the two often, they don't quite align. But I'm sure we can talk at length about that. So I know there are a couple of other questions here, but we're a little bit over time. So if I may, I think I'd suggest, I don't know if, Alisha, are there any other questions? We should release people if we're over time, so please feel free to just leave now. But Alisha, have you spotted any other questions in the chat that you would like to respond to before we draw to a close?
I think there was one for the presenters from Asha on do you see a difference in understanding social parameters that are usually overlooked or least prioritized because of its complex nature? And what difference can the MTF make in fulfilling the data gaps in social impact indicators? This was put across to the presenters.
Yeah, I guess this kind of speaks to what Malcolm was talking about, that there's a social impact is of increasing value to both public and private sector players these days. There is a lot of information there. I'm not sure what the sort of the appropriate social impact indicators are and whether they're sort of comprehensively covered. Malcolm, maybe you could reflect on that?
Well, I'll try. I mean, I think that some of these areas are very difficult to quantify, but there are metrics which are starting to come down the road, because, for example, the gold standard, which has been drawing up, well, actually ESMAP originally worked with gold standard to draw up these methodologies, of course, but they're now starting to be implemented. So, for example, on gender, I think one of the issues they've been focusing on mainly, which you can quantify, I think, is time saved, and to have some sort of way of measuring, well, how is the arduousness of the task, the unpleasantness of the task being avoided? How is the situation improved for women? So, I think the great thing is to be able to define what the metrics are, and then to be able to start working with those. And this is one of the things that came out of the E4I survey, that the funders were asking for, is that we need to report, and in order to report, we need to define what we are going to report. We need to decide what those metrics are. So I think one of the ways that the MTF can help is by working with people like 60 decibels and people in the business to see what kind of metrics we can actually zero in on and try and define those and try and set some standards. So I think that's one thing. I think some of the areas, I mean, I don't know whether zeroing in on, for example, the dailies, which is a very good methodology that's come out of this sort of HAPIT methodology, I don't know how that could necessarily come out of the MTF analysis as such. But I mean, I think the maybe it can be implied by some of the surveying work. I think that's something that we'd have to look at in more detail. So I think there's a lot there. I mean, I'm seriously impressed by the work that's been done. I think a lot of, and I think, as Alisha said, it really will help policymakers because it gives a really good feel for what's going on. So I think it's a big step forward. Whether we can kind of try and define some of these a little bit more and maybe set some standards, that may be something that we can do going forward.
Thanks, Malcolm. So Alisha, it sounds like there's a lot more work to be done. Malcolm's talking about more standards coming down the line on these social impact side of things and the gender side of things, which would be really interesting. But I guess, as with all these things, you've got to draw the line somewhere. Anyway, I think we'll draw it to close there. So thank you very much. All that remains for me is to thank our panel. I'd like to especially thank Paul Mbuthi for joining from Kenya. That's very kind of you to make the time. And Caroline as well, thank you. And thanks for joining us, Malcolm. That's been very, very helpful. Sorry we haven't managed to get through all your questions, but always good to have more questions than we can.